"Get your hands off my equipment." That's what he said. Not "excuse me." Not "can I help you." Just that. Cold, clipped, like she was something he'd found crawling across the floor of his OR. Dr. Renata Osei-Mensah, 44 years old, had been a cardiothoracic surgeon for 17 years. She had operated on a sitting senator, 2 Fortune 500 CEOs, and a child who the papers later called a miracle. She had steady hands and a slower resting heart rate than most people half her age. And standing in the hallway of Crestview Medical Center that Tuesday morning, in a plain gray hoodie and no badge visible, she did not flinch. She looked at him. Dr. Marcus Hale, 51 years old, chief of surgery, Crestview's golden boy, the man whose portrait hung in the donor corridor next to a plaque that said Excellence in Leadership 2019. He was still in his scrubs. His mask was pulled down below his chin. He had the kind of face that had probably always gotten what it wanted. She looked at the instrument tray she'd been examining, just looking, hands not even touching, and she looked back at him. "I wasn't touching it," she said. "You were standing over it. In a restricted corridor. I was. This is a sterile prep area. You need to leave." Now, before we get to what happened next, and believe me, what happened next is something Marcus Hale would spend the rest of that year trying to forget, let me take you back. Not far. Just far enough to understand exactly what kind of man he was before that morning, and exactly why the morning mattered as much as it did. Crestview Medical Center sat in the northeast corner of Hartford, Connecticut, 12 stories of glass, and poured concrete that the city had been quietly proud of since it opened in 2009. It had a Level I trauma designation, a nationally ranked cardiac unit, and a reputation that administrators liked to brag about at fundraising dinners. It also had, like most hospitals of its kind, a culture, quiet, layered, and mostly unspoken, about who belonged where and why. Marcus had been chief of surgery for 6 years. Before that, he'd been associate chief. Before that, senior attending. He had climbed the same ladder every step in the same building, and somewhere along the way he had confused longevity with authority. They are not the same thing. But Marcus didn't know that, or maybe he did and simply didn't care. The nurses on the 3rd floor called him the cold front, not to his face, never to his face, because you always felt him before you saw him. A shift in the air. A certain kind of silence that moved down the corridor ahead of him. The attending physicians kept their heads down when he walked by. The residents didn't speak unless spoken to. The cleaning staff had learned to make themselves invisible, pressing into doorways, timing their routes around his known schedule. There had been complaints. Of course there had been complaints. A 3rd-year resident named Priya had filed a formal grievance 18 months ago after Marcus dressed her down in front of a full surgical team for a charting error that she had, in fact, already corrected. The grievance had been reviewed. The review had concluded that Dr. Hale's communication style, while direct, did not constitute a violation of policy. Priya had transferred to Northwestern 6 weeks later. Nobody mentioned it. There was also the matter of Dominic, the surgical tech, who'd been with Crestview for 11 years, and who Marcus had publicly accused of misplacing instruments that Marcus himself had signed out. Dominic had documentation. He'd shown it to HR. HR had noted the documentation and reminded Dominic that certain conversations were better handled informally. Dominic had eventually gone back to his job, but something in him had gone quieter after that. The way things go quiet when they've been told, more than once, that they are not worth the noise. Have you ever worked somewhere like that? Maybe you know the particular exhaustion of it. The calculation you do every morning before you walk through the door. How much to say, how much to swallow, what's worth it, and what isn't. Most people in that hospital had made their calculations and arrived at the same answer. Marcus Hale was not worth it. Not directly, not out loud. That's the environment Renata walked into at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning, carrying a cup of coffee she'd bought from the cart across the street because she'd wanted to see the neighborhood before she went inside. She had been in Hartford exactly once before for a conference 3 years ago. She'd liked it then, quiet winter light, good bone structure to the old buildings. She was wearing the gray hoodie because she'd been on a red-eye from Seattle, and it was what she'd slept in. Her luggage was in a locker downstairs. She had a 9 a.m. meeting, and she'd arrived early because that was what she did, had always done. Arrived early, looked around, tried to understand a place before the place understood her. She was not hiding anything. She simply hadn't put her badge on yet. She was looking at the instrument tray because she'd heard the cardiac unit had recently upgraded its retractor inventory, and she was, among other things, deeply interested in retractors. She hadn't touched anything. She was just looking, and then Marcus had appeared. "This is a sterile prep area. You need to leave." "I have a meeting at 9, she said. "I was told I could wait. I don't know who told you that, but they were wrong. And I don't know who let you up here, but whoever it was is going to hear about it. You need to go back to the main lobby and wait there." She studied him for a moment. There was something almost clinical about the way she did it. Not hostile, not wounded, just observational, like she was noting a set of symptoms. "Can I ask who you are?" she said. The question genuinely surprised him. You could see it in the slight pull around his eyes, the pause before he answered. People didn't usually ask Marcus Hale who he was. They already knew, or they figured it out fast enough, that it amounted to the same thing. "I'm the chief of surgery," he said, "and you're in a restricted area." "Right." She nodded slowly. "And I'm telling you, I have a scheduled meeting. Is there someone else I could speak with? A department administrator, maybe?" "There's no one you need to speak with. You need to leave, doctor," she started. "Hale, and you still haven't told me who you are or what your business is here." She opened her mouth. And then, and this is the part that mattered, though Marcus wouldn't understand why until much later, she closed it again. She took a breath. She picked up her coffee from where she'd set it on the window ledge. "I'll find the administrator myself," she said. "Thank you for your time." She walked away. Marcus watched her go. Then he turned back to his OR and put the entire interaction out of his mind, the way he'd always disposed of things that didn't seem worth keeping. But what Marcus Hale would give anything to take back is what he did in the next 40 minutes. He went to the nurse's station on the 3rd floor, where Candace, the charge nurse who had been at Crestview for 14 years, was reviewing staffing charts. He leaned on the counter and he said, loudly enough for the 2 residents standing nearby to hear, "There was a woman wandering around the sterile corridor. Gray hoodie. No badge. I don't know if she was a patient or a visitor or what, but I want to know how she got up here and I want it documented." Candace looked up. "Did she say who she was?" "She said she had a 9 o'clock meeting." He said it the way you say something you don't believe. "Keep an eye out." He walked away. Candace watched him go. Then she looked at the 2 residents, who looked at each other, and nobody said anything. Here's what Candace knew that Marcus did not. What almost everyone on the administrative side of Crestview knew that Marcus, apparently, had not been told, or had been told and hadn't retained, or had retained and simply hadn't connected to a woman in a gray hoodie standing in his corridor. Crestview had been acquired 14 months ago. Not a merger, not a partnership. An acquisition, full and complete, by a private healthcare group called Meridian Health Partners. A group that had, in the past 8 years, purchased 7 hospital systems across the eastern seaboard and turned 4 of them around so dramatically that 2 had ended up in the New England Journal of Medicine as case studies. Meridian was known for being quiet about its leadership. It was known for doing its due diligence thoroughly and without announcement. It was known, above all things, for its founder and CEO, who had built the company from a single struggling clinic in Baltimore in 2003, and who had, in the intervening 2 decades, become one of the most respected figures in American healthcare administration. Her name was Dr. Renata Osei-Mensah. She did not usually introduce herself in hallways. At 8:58 a.m., the doors of the Crestview boardroom on the 11th floor opened to receive 12 people. The hospital's existing administrative board, 3 representatives from Meridian's operations team, legal counsel on both sides, and 2 members of the cardiac surgery department who had been invited specifically because the cardiac unit was the flagship program under review. At 9:01, Renata walked in. She'd changed. Same building, different woman, or rather, same woman, finally visible. Navy blazer, hair pulled back, a leather portfolio under one arm. She set her coffee, a new one, from the hospital's own cafe downstairs, at the head of the table, and she sat down and she said good morning to the room. Marcus Hale was not in the boardroom. He had not been invited. That would change within the hour. The meeting ran until 11:15. Renata asked precise, probing questions. She had read the last 4 years of outcome data, the staffing turnover reports, the patient satisfaction surveys, the grievance filings. She had a particular interest in the grievance filings. She'd flagged 3 of them before she ever set foot in Hartford. At 11:20, she asked to speak with the head of HR privately. At 11:47, she asked that Dr. Marcus Hale be brought to the room. Now, let's pause here for just a second, because this is the part of the story where you might expect a dramatic confrontation. Raised voices, a finger pointed across a table, the big moment where everything gets said out loud. But that's not how Renata operated. It never had been. The people who'd worked with her longest would tell you that the most uncomfortable thing about her wasn't her anger. She rarely raised her voice, but her stillness, the way she would look at you across a table, and you would understand, with a certainty that landed somewhere in your chest, that she already knew everything there was to know and was simply deciding what to do with it. Marcus walked in at 11:52. He was still in his scrubs. He hadn't been told much, just that the board meeting had concluded and his presence was requested. He'd assumed it was about the cardiac expansion proposal he'd submitted last month. He walked in with the confidence of a man who had walked into many rooms and found them waiting for him. He saw Renata at 11:52 and 4 seconds. She was looking at him with that same observational expression, noting symptoms. It took him a moment. Gray hoodie, navy blazer. The mind doesn't always connect the dots in the order it should. But then something shifted in his face. A recalibration, like a thermometer dropping. "Dr. Hale," said the head of HR, a woman named Joanna, "this is Dr. Renata Osei-Mensah. She's the CEO of Meridian Health Partners, which, as you know, acquired Crestview 14 months ago." Marcus said nothing. His jaw was doing something complicated. "She's here as part of an operational review," Joanna continued, "which includes a review of departmental leadership." Marcus looked at Renata. Renata looked at Marcus. She did not smile. She did not look away. "We've met," she said simply, "briefly, this morning." The silence in the room had a particular quality, the kind that happens when several people are carefully not looking at each other. "Dr. Hale," she said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clearly." She folded her hands on the table. "I've been acquiring and restructuring hospital systems for 20 years. In that time, I've encountered every kind of institutional dysfunction you can imagine. Billing fraud, gross negligence, genuine incompetence at the highest levels. And I'll tell you honestly, the things that keep me up at night aren't the dramatic failures. They're the quiet ones. The cultures that grind people down slowly. The leaders who've mistaken their title for their worth." She paused. "Do you understand what I mean?" Marcus's mouth opened closed. "I reviewed 3 grievance filings this morning that I want to discuss with you in detail. I also want to discuss the incident in the corridor at approximately 7:45 a.m. But before we get into that," she glanced at Joanna, who slid a folder across the table. "I'd like you to take a look at what's in front of you." He picked up the folder. His hands were not as steady as hers. It contained, among other things, the Priya grievance, including the parts that hadn't made it into the official response, the Dominic documentation, a summary of exit interviews from 14 staff members who had left Crestview in the past 3 years, 6 of whom had cited leadership climate as a contributing factor, and a formal account already written and signed by 2 witnesses of the corridor incident that morning, including Marcus's subsequent comments at the nurse's station. Candace, it turned out, had written quickly. "I want to be direct with you," Renata said. "What you did this morning, the way you spoke to me in that corridor, that's not the reason this review is happening. This review was scheduled months ago. But what happened this morning told me something about how you operate when you think no one important is watching, and that matters to me more than almost anything else." "I didn't know who you were," Marcus said. His voice was different now. The cold had gone out of it. "I had no idea." "I know," she said. "That's exactly my point." The room was very quiet. "You didn't know who I was," she said. "So you decided who I was, based on—" She let that land. "What, exactly?" "A gray hoodie, no badge visible, and the fact that you didn't recognize my face." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to think very carefully about what information you used to make that decision, and then I'd like you to tell me whether you'd have made the same decision about someone who looked different." Marcus did not answer. There was no answer that would have helped him. "Here's what's going to happen," Renata said. "Joanna and I are going to meet separately with the department heads this afternoon. We're going to have an honest conversation about leadership and culture in this building, and it's going to involve some changes. The specifics of your situation will be determined through a formal process over the next 2 weeks, in accordance with your employment agreement." She stood. Almost everyone else in the room stood. "What I can tell you," she said, looking at him one last time, "is that what determines your future here isn't what happened this morning. It's what you do with what you understand now." She picked up her portfolio and her coffee. She walked to the door. She paused with one hand on the frame. "Oh, and Dr. Hale," she said, without turning around. "The instrument trays in the sterile corridor. You've upgraded to the Lanford retractors. Good choice. They're better than what you had before." She walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft, unremarkable click. Marcus stood at the table for a long moment. Joanna began gathering her papers. The Meridian representatives were already typing. Nobody was looking at him, and somehow that was worse than if they had been. He walked back down to the 3rd floor in the elevator alone. Here's the thing about moments like that one. They don't announce themselves beforehand. Nobody sends you a calendar invite that says, "Tuesday, 11:52 a.m., the day you find out what kind of person you've been." They arrive looking like ordinary mornings. A woman in a hallway, a cup of coffee, a judgment made in 3 seconds flat because the brain is fast and bias is faster. And nobody was there to see it except, as it turned out, everybody. Marcus Hale was placed on administrative leave, pending a formal review 12 days later. The review took 3 weeks. At the end of it, he was given 2 options: a structured remediation program with specific benchmarks and external oversight, or a severance package with a non-disparagement clause. He took a long time to decide. He chose the remediation program. Whether that was the right choice, or whether he followed through, is a different story for a different day. What matters is that he was no longer running that floor the way he'd been running it. The cold front lifted, not all at once. Gradually, the way weather actually changes, not with a dramatic break, but with a slow, almost imperceptible shift, until one morning the nurses realized they were breathing differently. Priya didn't come back. Some things don't undo themselves, but she heard about it, eventually through the networks that exist in medicine. The quiet channels where residents talk to each other about which programs are safe and which ones aren't, and she filed what happened away somewhere in the back of her mind. Not as comfort, exactly. More as data, as proof that the math didn't always come out wrong. Dominic heard about it the day it happened. Candace told him in the break room, quietly, between shifts. He didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "Huh," and he went back to work. He still works there. He's been there 16 years now. And Dr. Renata Osei-Mensah, flew back to Baltimore on a Thursday evening. The same gray hoodie in her carry-on, the same unassuming way of moving through airports that she'd had since before the company, before the acquisitions, before any of this. She had grown up watching her mother work double shifts as a home health aide in Atlanta, and then drive an hour back to the house where they lived and cook dinner standing up because there was no other way to do it. Her mother had a genius for stretching things: money, time, patience, and she had taught Renata the only lesson that had ever really stuck. The room doesn't owe you recognition. You earn it or you don't, and the earning is the part that matters. She had not, technically, earned recognition in that corridor. She'd simply existed in it, in the wrong clothes at the wrong time, with the wrong face for the assumptions Marcus was making, and he had looked at her, at all of that, and made his call. What he hadn't understood, what people like him rarely do until it's too late, is that the way you treat someone when you think they have nothing to offer you is the most honest thing about you. Strip away the performance, the professional courtesies, the carefully managed impressions. And what you're left with is that moment in the hallway. Who you are when you think it doesn't count. It always counts. On the flight home, she read through the cardiac outcomes data one more time. The numbers were good, better than she'd expected when they'd first signed the acquisition papers. With the right structural changes, the right leadership, the right culture. And culture was always the hardest variable, the one no spreadsheet could fully model. Crestview could be something genuinely excellent. She closed the folder. Outside the window, the lights of the eastern seaboard stretched out below her in long, bright threads. Hospital districts and neighborhoods and ordinary blocks where people were finishing their Tuesdays without any idea how close they lived, to places that were deciding, right now, what kind of institutions they were going to be. She thought about the retractors. They really were better than what they'd had before. She leaned back and closed her eyes, and the plane carried her home.